Picture this. You're sitting in your car. The officer walks back to your window. Everything seems routine. Then he says, "Hey, can I see your phone for a second?" Most people think the encounter is still about the traffic stop. It isn't, because at that exact moment, the officer is no longer looking at your driving. He's looking at your information, and the next 5 seconds may determine whether the encounter stays simple or becomes something much bigger. Not because of what's on your phone, because of what you do with it. Most people don't know their rights until it's too late. If you want to stay one step ahead and never get caught off guard, hit subscribe now. And if this opened your eyes, share it with someone and tell me your thoughts in the comments. Today, we're going to break down the single decision point hidden behind that question, the trap, the moment everything changes, and the exact sentence that keeps you from making the mistake most drivers make. Let's get into it. The trap starts because the request sounds harmless. An officer doesn't usually say, "I want access to your private digital information." Instead, it sounds casual. "Mind if I see your phone? Can I take a quick look? Can I check something real fast?" Most people hear the word quick. Most people hear the word just. Most people hear the friendly tone, and they immediately think, if I have nothing to hide, what's the problem? So they grab the phone, unlock it, and hand it over, without realizing they've just crossed the most important decision point in the encounter. Let's look at how it usually happens. "Officer, can I see your phone?" Driver, "Sure." "Officer, can you unlock it for me?" Driver, "No problem." That's it. The decision has been made. And most drivers don't even realize it happened. Why? Because they think the request is about cooperation. The officer is thinking about information. Now let's be clear. Officers ask questions and request information for investigative reasons. That's their job. If something doesn't make sense, if a story needs verification, if evidence might exist, gathering information is part of the investigation. The phone request isn't random. Phones contain messages, photos, videos, location history, contacts, search history, app activity. In many cases, a phone can answer questions faster than a conversation can. That's why the request matters. Not because the officer is doing something wrong, but because the amount of information involved is dramatically different from answering a simple question. And that's where people make their mistake. They focus on being polite. The officer focuses on obtaining information. Two completely different objectives. Now let's get to the decision point, because this is where encounters change. The officer asks, "Can I see your phone?" At that moment, most people believe there are only two options. Option 1, hand it over. Option 2, start arguing. But neither is necessary. Let's look at the wrong response first. "Officer, can I see your phone?" Driver, "Yeah, sure." Officer takes the phone. "Officer, can you unlock it?" Driver, "Okay." Now the situation has changed. The officer has more access, more information, more investigative opportunities. And the driver may not fully understand what they just agreed to. Notice something important. Nothing dramatic happened. Nobody raised their voice. Nobody got arrested. Nobody got threatened. The encounter simply moved into a different phase, and it happened because of one decision. Now let's look at the correct response. "Officer, can I see your phone?" Driver, "I do not consent to any search of my phone." That's it. Simple, professional, calm, no attitude, no argument, no lecture. Just, "I do not consent to any search of my phone." Watch what happens next. "Officer, why not?" Driver, "I do not consent to any search of my phone." Officer, "If you've got nothing to hide, why refuse?" Driver, "I do not consent to any search of my phone." Officer, "It'll only take a second." Driver, "I do not consent to any search of my phone." Notice what's happening. The officer may continue asking. The officer may continue investigating. The officer may continue gathering information through lawful means. But you've clearly communicated your position, and you've done it without escalating the encounter. That's the exact phrase you need to remember. "I do not consent to any search of my phone." Say it again. "I do not consent to any search of my phone." That's the sentence. Not a speech. Not a debate. Not a constitutional seminar. One sentence. Now let's talk about what happens next, because many viewers assume the conversation ends there. Usually it doesn't. You may hear pushback. "Officer, why are you being difficult?" Response, "I do not consent to any search of my phone." Officer, "What are you hiding?" Response, "I do not consent to any search of my phone." Officer, "So you're refusing?" Response, "I do not consent to any search of my phone." The key is consistency. The moment people get nervous, they start talking. And talking creates new information. The more information people volunteer, the more directions the encounter can take. That's why the exact phrase matters. It keeps you focused. It keeps the conversation controlled. And it prevents emotional reactions from creating unnecessary complications. Now let's briefly discuss the legal foundation. The reason phones are treated differently is because courts have recognized that modern smartphones contain enormous amounts of personal information. One of the most important cases was the Supreme Court decision in Riley v. California. The court acknowledged that phones are fundamentally different from many other physical items because of the volume and nature of information they contain. The important takeaway isn't memorizing case law. The important takeaway is understanding why the request matters. A phone isn't just a phone. It's often a record of significant parts of a person's life. That's why the decision point exists. And that's why you should recognize it immediately. Let's put everything together. The trap is believing the request is casual. The officer asks, "Can I see your phone?" Most people think they're simply being asked to cooperate. In reality, they're standing at the single decision point that determines where the encounter goes next. The wrong response is handing over the phone and unlocking it without thinking. The correct response is calm, professional, and simple. "I do not consent to any search of my phone. No arguments, no hostility, no lectures. Just one sentence." Because the smartest drivers understand something most people miss. The encounter doesn't change when the officer asks the question. The encounter changes when the driver answers it. And that's why the smartest drivers aren't the ones who talk the most. They're the ones who recognize the decision point before the officer does.